So start your engines and charge your grav plates. Today we're talking about the strengths of the Primaris vehicle line in 9th edition 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. The other week we talked about the Primaris infantry units in the Space Marine arsenal, and today I thought it would be good to focus on the vehicles. In general, I'll admit that most of the Primaris vehicles aren't really quite on the same level as the infantry units, and I think it was a bit of a flaw in the Space Marine Codex that they weren't very good at balancing the core units versus the non-core units. They were kind of overshadowed from day one, and the amount of very high damage weapons that are present in 40k at the moment really hasn't helped vehicles anymore as the edition's gone on. In any case though, I thought it could be fun to do a bit of a comparison, so for this video we're going to rank the Codex Space Marine vehicle units in order, anything with the vehicle keyword, plus I thought I'd throw in the Invader ATV, as it does kind of compete with them as a gun platform with a fair amount of wounds, though of course being technically a biker it does have a fair few more synergies. Just like last time, I fully admit that giving units an individual rank is just a touch on the arbitrary side. Plenty of these I could happily be persuaded to move up or down a few placings. A fair few of them are kind of comparing units with vastly different battlefield roles. They don't really stack up perfectly against each other, and of course if you're playing different chapters, there'll be a big difference in certain units' strengths. In any case, what we'll do today is go through each of the vehicle units in order, starting with the weakest, talk about some of their positives and negatives, why I've ranked them where I have, and some of the strongest chapters that they have synergy with. Of course, when chapters are concerned, Iron Hands are going to come up a lot in any sort of vehicle ranking. Their feel no pain and slower degrading is generally helpful for vehicles, so is their super doctrine, and a lot of the abilities of their characters and things help out too, such as their psychic powers and stratagems. Pretty much most of these would be quite decent in Iron Hands, maybe more so than a fair few other chapters, though plenty of the others do shine through for certain units and certain roles. In any case, jumping straight into it, we'll start with the Hammerfall Bunker. The Space Marine unique fortification, technically it does have the vehicle keyword, but unfortunately I think it's one of the hardest ones to use in current army lists. The thing packs a couple of heavy rockets hitting on 4s, and then has the unusual special rule of being able to shoot at every single vehicle within range of its guns, though it only does so at the profile of a single heavy bolter or heavy flamer, depending on how you equip it. Theoretically, with the heavy bolters, you could be putting out some fairly serious firepower, but it's kind of dependent on your opponent having loads and loads of units in range and in line of sight of it, and even then you're only going to be doing some chip damage at best to any of them. One heavy bolter hitting on 4s is not going to make massive dents. It is reasonably tough for the points, I guess, but I think that this thing is generally going to need to justify itself via damage output, and it just can't really do that at the moment with only ballistic skill 4+, which really hurts to modifiers, and with terrain dense tables and low numbers of units likely to be exposed at 2000 points or less, I think it's just rarely going to be worth it. Being immobile and the fortification deployment issues really don't help either. Maybe it could be worth it on a really big game with loads and loads of units on both sides, but at most normal sized games it's just not going to be worth the cost. Moving on, in 8th place I've chosen to rank the Repulsor and its cousin the Repulsor Executioner. After having a bit of a heyday in 8th edition with a whole load of Space Marine character auras making these vastly dangerous gun platforms, they really got cut down pretty brutally in 9th edition, remaining at a very high points cost, not being able to take advantage of any of the auras, and the Repulsor Executioner lost its double shoot rules. On the positives, they do have really quite a lot of guns, you're going to be quite good at repelling 1 wound infantry if they get close to the tanks, and they both have the option of packing at least some anti-armor threats too. If you're looking for a single big model to layer with individual unit buffs, things like Tech Marines, I guess you could do worse, and the two of them do have a bit of transport capacity as well, which I guess could be handy for Primaris units opportunistically jumping out of them, and hopefully helping to get an alpha strike on the enemy. The main issue with these is that they're just not massively efficient either in terms of damage output or defense, and particularly not in defense. Only 16 wounds at toughness 8 just really isn't enough at over 300 points. It feels like with these you're kind of banking on your opponent not having any serious anti-tank. It's pretty crazy when you can compare these to something like a Tau Storm Surge, a super heavy Lord of War for basically the same points, with just vastly better durability and damage. As a really big unit bristling with guns, they do seem like Iron Hands might be one of the best ways to get good value out of them. They're a pretty reasonable target for the Iron Stone, plus potentially the psychic power to have them hit on 2s, or the 1 command point stratagem to put them back into Devastator Doctrine. Otherwise, potentially Black Templars for their 5+ invul save could help, or Salamander's rerolls could be useful on the really big gun from the Repulsor Executioner. Overall, I feel that they're potentially intimidating if you're playing at a more casual level, but against lists with good amount of anti-tank, they're really going to underperform for the amount of points they have to spend on them. Next up, in 7th place, I've chosen to rank the Firestrike Servo Turret. I kind of felt that this one was pretty close in power to the Repulsor Executioners for the points. These things are just a bit underwhelming in terms of both their damage and their durability. I just really don't compete particularly well on any level. They are relatively easy to use, just sit down and shoot. They could potentially be parked on a backfield objective to hopefully hold that while laying down a bit of firepower. And having ballistic skill 2 plus is a bit of an advantage. It does mean that they're kind of quite resistant to enemy modifiers. However, just their damage output really isn't all that impressive, and their durability really is quite bad, only 5 wounds with a 2 plus save. For either 90 points or 130 points is really very bad by 9th edition standards. You could easily be losing one of these per shot against things like Eldar lance weapons. Low movement really doesn't help, particularly for the shorter range Las Talon, which is only 24 inches and costs a massive 130 points. I think I'd be more tempted to fill them with the autocannons as a backfield camping unit. At least then hopefully they might be able to chip away over multiple turns rather than just being gunned down immediately. I feel like they might have somewhat good synergy with the Raven Guard or Stealthy. With their 2 plus save, getting light cover at longer ranges is pretty nice. And again, maybe Salamanders could be kind of useful for some rerolls on their wound rolls for shooting, particularly with the last Talon. In general though, these guys really just need a points cut. If they're going to be a dedicated firepower unit and do little else, they really need to do that firepower well and be somewhat durable. In 6th place we have the Storm Speeders, the very fast Primaris land speeder equivalent that hits fairly hard but doesn't really have all that much durability. These guys have seen a couple of points decreases from chapter approved, and it's got to the point where they're kind of usable but still a bit underwhelming in my opinion. Their firepower is now kind of okay and comparable to some of the other fast attack choices. I feel that perhaps the Hammer Strike and Thunder Strike are the more exciting ones for value, compared with the cheaper Hail Strike. Still though, even at their diminished points cost, they really still have very bad defense for that cost. Only toughness 6 and 10 wounds is just really easy to kill for something like 150 points. And compared with things like attack bikes, which fill a fairly similar role, they don't have core, and you're kind of forced to commit to one really big heavy model with a degrading profile, which again is another disadvantage. Still though, with a good movement, hopefully they should usually be getting the Alpha Strike on the enemy. Dark Angels can be particularly good with them, with a 5 plus invul save from Raven Wing and access to a few interesting stratagems. Salamanders could help out with the Hammer Strike with its very heavy melter weapon, and of course Iron Hands with the usual vehicle things, and also protecting against degrading a little bit. I've got a bit more time for these compared with some of the lower choices. Moving on, we're starting to get into the stronger choices now, and the Invicta Tactical Warsuit I thought was an interesting one to try and place on this list, because I feel this one more than anything else gets massively stronger in the Ultramarines army compared with just about anywhere else. The reason being is that the Invicta Tactical Warsuit can forward deploy, which means that you can get a lot of line of sight and potentially even early charges on the enemy army. But in 9th edition, when you set them up, you don't know whether you're going to be going first or second. If you go first, then potentially setting up very close to the enemy could be really powerful. You can get a full turn of damage out and alpha strike them. But if you get unlucky and you go second, then there's a good chance that the enemy just kills this very easily, as it's not all that tough with only toughness 6. It's so much better than the Ultramarines because they get the best of both worlds. Their rapid redeployment stratagem for 2 command points can allow them to pull their Invictus back to their own deployment zone if they happen to go second, and just deploy them really aggressively and leave them there if they go first. For that reason, in Ultramarines, I'd rank them quite a lot higher than this, but for most chapters, I think that this is roughly where they belong, as they're a bit of a double-edged sword with that forward deployment. In general, though, as the Walker goes, I think they're sort of reasonable in terms of their shooting and melee. They do put out really quite a lot of anti-infantry shots, but a lot of the damage is really quite anti-infantry focused. They're not going to be doing all that much to tanks, and as mentioned, their defense isn't particularly impressive for the points as well. 13 wounds at toughness 6 will wilt fairly easily to 9th edition weapons. Besides Ultramarines, Salamanders can be really quite nice with the Flamer, Templars can get the 5 plus invul save from their Vow, Iron Hands will do their usual, and with quite a decent flurry of low strength, low AP weapons, I feel they can be fairly strong in Imperial Fists, where they get ignore cover on all of those, and of course it helps out the Heavy Bolter. Next on the list, I've chosen to rank the Invader ATV 4th place, fairly fast firepower that's relatively tanky, and a fairly reasonable choice for on-the-move firepower for Space Marines. I think they're just a little bit behind attack bikes in the most optimised lists though. The Invader does have a fair amount of stuff going for it. You can either mount the Gatling cannon or the multi-melter, and then back that up with a fair flurry of bolt shots. Despite not being able to resurrect them anymore, they still have quite good synergy with apothecaries, giving them feel no pain type saves and healing all of their wounds. They can fall back and shoot for a command point, use transhuman physiology, and get a little bit of melee power against infantry if they do want to follow up their shooting with a charge. Overall, I feel that they're pretty solid all-rounders for how fast they move. Perhaps the main issue is the existence of the attack bike that does have the core keyword for all the buffs, and perhaps their damage isn't enormously exciting for the points cost. They do pay a bit of a premium for it, with being a little bit tougher and of course quite fast. Again, quite a nice one in Dark Angels, as they get to be Raven Wing for their 5+ invul plus the stratagems. Again, Salamanders all quite like the multi-melters, and Imperial Fists all like Ignores cover, plus getting exploding sixes on those bolters. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Impulsor in 3rd place, though I think that my placings from 2nd to 5th are really quite close. I could certainly have been persuaded to put the Invader ATVs or Invictors on the same level as this guy. Since the Codex came out, Impulsors do generally feel like they're paying a fairly hefty price for what they bring to the table, but for the right units I do feel that they can be decently strong. It is pretty powerful to be able to move quite as far as they do, then disembark and move objective secured models. You're pretty much guaranteeing that you can hold down objectives really quite a long way away, on turn 2 for example. It can chip in with a little bit of anti-infantry fire with storm bolters and stobbers, and has some fairly nice synergy with some of the more pricey Primaris units, things like Blade Guard, Hellblasters, Sword Brethren, although delivering objective secured models I think is pretty reasonable as well. Once the models are in place, it can just get on with being an annoyance unit for the rest of the game, parking itself on objectives, chipping away at infantry, doing some nuisance charges or screening potentially, so quite good to have a fast model like that on the board after it's done its main job. It's certainly not without its issues though. It's not really all that tough for the cost, even with the shield dome, which is a big negative in a transport that's mainly about being fast and tough, and I think that the points are a bit high to really justify spamming it across a whole army, and it does feel like it's a bit of a niche and elite transport compared with other armies that want to take lots of them. In terms of good chapters, I think Black Templars maybe particularly have some good use for this. With their 5+ invul save vow, it means they can essentially skip the shield dome if they want to, making it a lot more efficient. Plus, I think it's a fairly reasonable choice for delivering those fancy new sword brethren into the fray. Otherwise, Iron Hands as normal for vehicle things, Imperial Fists all like those storm bolters, and in particular melee chapters I think will get a fair bit out of the Impulsor as well, like Blood Angels or White Scars. Having a nice battlefield bunker to park in the midfield and then jump Blade Guard or Assault Intercessors out of isn't really the worst idea. Next up, and the unit I've chosen to rank in 2nd place, are the Gladiator tanks. Again, I'll admit with these ones I don't feel that they're significantly better than the last few choices. I do feel that Invader ATVs, Invictors and Impulsors are kind of on a similar sort of level to them power-wise. Slightly hard to compare though when they have really quite different battlefield roles. In terms of strengths for the Gladiator, I would argue it's perhaps one of the most efficient tank choices in the entire Space Marine Codex, though that's not exactly saying a whole load at the moment, given that as a class they tend to be a bit underpowered. Still though, the Gladiator Reaper with its enormous amounts of AP-1 shots, and the Gladiator Valiant with its 8 very hefty anti-tank shots both seem like very reasonable choices for damage output, and again, like the Repulsors, they're quite a decent choice for any buffs that do work on non-core vehicles, things like the Tech Marine +1 to hit or the Iron Hands Ironstone. Otherwise, they are fairly fast, have okay toughness with toughness 8 and a good number of wounds, and that grab field stratagem is kind of handy, -2 inches to charges, could break deep strike charges, and it also gives them the power to fall back and shoot. Still though, even despite repeated points drops, their lack of core compared with the Dreadnought choices is generally going to still have them at 2nd tier compared with those, though in general I think if you want a firepower unit that doesn't need all that much support, they aren't exactly the worst choice. As usual for vehicles, Iron Hands are going to be decent with them. They'll like the lack of degrading and all the various buffs that you can stack on them, and again Salamanders are kind of interesting with the melters that you can get on the Valiants. That brings us to the 1st place choice, and I'm sure to no one's surprise we have the Redemptor Dreadnought. I still believe that this guy remains king of the Primaris vehicles, even despite seeing a small points increase. Even if it might be a little bit less efficient than it was before, the Redemptor Dreadnought still remains excellent. Its raw firepower numbers are good, its raw defensive numbers are good, with a -1 damage characteristic from Duty Eternal, and unlike most of the rest of the list, it also punches very well in melee, having a good chance to crunch some vehicles there with that damage D3+3 fist. When you stack that all with having the core keyword, it means that you can then buff this with all your Space Marine characters and things, and you can even turn these into a mini captain or lieutenant each turn that you need to, with one command point and wisdom of the ancients, which both increases their own firepower and the firepower of things nearby. Within Codex Space Marines, this thing really just doesn't have that much comparison. It's easily one of the best firepower units and gets bonus points because it can also do melee as well. Though of course, just as with every other unit on this list, anything with high damage and high AP is going to make a mess of it, meaning that perhaps the chapters that get the most out of the Redemptors are the ones that give it a 5+ invul save. Chapters like Death Watch with their Relic Storm Shield, or Templars with their 5+ invul for their Vow. Often you'll see 3 of these working in synergy alongside something like a Captain or a Tech Marine perhaps, laying down a bunch of real general purpose quality firepower, and then being a fairly respectable melee threat as well if anything that's very heavy gets too close. Pretty much every chapter can do fairly well with these though, certainly one of the Space Marine datasheets that remains strong no matter which way you play it. So with that just about brings us to the end of our ranking of Primaris vehicles. So to round up, here's the overall list. Obviously it's just one opinion, it does depend on your value of damage output versus utility for the units, and as I've tried to mention as we go along, the chapter choice does really influence exactly how strong something's going to be. For example, Ultramarines and that Invicta, or say Dark Angels and Storm Speeders and the ATV. I feel that I'm fairly happy with the ranking of most of these. I say that choices 2 to 5 though I think are really quite debatable, and I could have ranked them very differently. Invictus do better in Ultramarines, the Impulsor maybe depends on what you need to deliver, ATVs doing better in White Scars or Dark Angels maybe, and perhaps Gladiators being a touch more exciting in Iron Hands. Still though, I do feel that the vast majority of this list could probably do with a bit of a buff compared with the other scary armies out there. Space Marine vehicles in general, outside of a few Dreadnoughts, just really haven't been holding up quite so well to the trials of 9th edition. So let me know what you think then. Are there any vehicles here that I've overestimated or underestimated? I look forward to your feedback as always down in the comments. Always happy to hear the insights of seasoned generals. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines as the year goes on. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that's of interest to you, feel free to check it out down in the link in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.